In this video, we're going to cover 4 different options for Fleshtone variations for your fashion rendering. Along with the 4 different variations that I'm going to teach you, there's also a bunch more markers that will fall in the range of Fleshtones, and I'll show you these at the end of the video. If you just want to know the formulas for what I've come up with for the 4 basic Fleshtones, I'll tell you those right away. And then later on, we're going to go ahead and learn how to make this chart and why I'm doing what I do, also with mixing 2 different colors for each Fleshtone. If you wanted to learn more options for the Fleshtones, you can also skip towards the end of the video where I'm going to lay out the colors here so we can get a better look at them and the different options and how they compare to the 4 that I prefer. Generally speaking, going from lighter to darker, we have a Fleshtone that would be similar to Asian, European, Hispanic, and African. An example here is from a swimsuit demo that I did, and you can see here I'm using the light sand European Fleshtones. If you just want to know real quick the formulas that I'm using, basically for the lightest one I'm using buff mixed with pink. For the middle one here we have light sand with pink. And then moving into our darker skin tone we have sand with salmon. And of course our darkest here is craft brown with deep salmon. The tools that you're going to need for this assignment is going to be your Ben Feng rag marker paper. As well, you're going to want to have a 2H pencil or just a regular number 2 pencil, your size 8 micron pen. The markers that I'll be using are the Chartpak Add Marker. And they'll also say on there, sometimes they'll say tri-tip because it has 3 different angles on the tip here. And then you'll see the different colors are labeled here with a word, so for instance light sand, and then they also have an item code number. For instance, this is P138. We're going to need to have buff, light sand, sand, and craft brown markers, as well as pink, salmon, deep salmon, and I like to have a separate piece of cloth just to touch my markers on here. After you use your markers, always be sure to close this totally tight till it snaps, or tap it on the tabletop so it's sealed nice and tight. And then when you store it, you'll want to store these horizontally. That way the tip will always stay wet. So be sure not to store them in a cup where they're upright, or else the tips of these will get dried out. And be sure not to mix the lighter colors on top of a darker color, or else you're going to stain the felt tip and you're going to change the original color of the marker. And you'll also want some extra pieces of inexpensive copy paper so you can put this behind your project as we're coloring. Okay, so the paper we're going to use is the Ben Feng Graphics 360 marker paper. But something that's really important to know is there's a few different marker papers available from Ben Feng in the graphics series. This marker paper here is 100% rag marker paper, and it's very important to notice the rag part of this. Also inside of here it's 13.5 pounds, or the same as 51 grams. Now the 13.5 pounds, that's letting you know that this paper is translucent. So for instance, if I had a drawing that I liked, I put it behind here, I can see through, and now I can come in with my pencil and trace this off to the front. On some of the marker paper, you're going to notice it's 16 pound, and it'll be less transparent, so that's not the kind that you want. Something else that's really important is this marker paper has 2 different sides to it. So for instance, the front of the paper is really smooth and pressed, and you can come in here and you can put all of your pencil, color pencil, and ink and any other mixed media on the front. Now the back of this paper is fuzzy. So for the back of the paper, You use that to use the markers only and nothing else. So no pencil, no ink, nothing, just the markers. And what you'll do is you'll color from the back of the paper, and then you'll come back, and here on the front is where you're going to finish your drawings. Also keep in mind that whenever you're using this paper, you're going to want to wash and dry your hands really well. The reason being is because your fingers have oils on them, and if you touch from the top here, when you start coming back with color pencil, you're going to have these dark spots. And the same thing will happen with your markers here on the back. Now, since this paper has two different sides to it, you're going to want to remember which side is which. So as you open this for the very first time, the front of the paper is for everything but markers. And usually what I'll do is I'll take a light color pencil and I'll come down in this corner and I'll put a little happy face to remind myself this is the pencil side up. Then as I turn this corner over, it's hard to see that happy face on this side, and that lets me know that this is the side for markers only. Now once you have your happy face on the front side of the paper, let's go ahead and tear this out, because we're going to be flipping this paper over back and forth, and we also want to make sure we don't put any color or markings on the other clean blank sheets. Now one other thing you're going to want to know about this marker paper, here it says there's no bleed through, but you're going to notice as you do your projects that it does bleed through, and you're going to want to have an extra piece of paper to put behind it when you put the markers down. This will help you to keep from staining the table that you're working on or through other layers of paper that you don't want to mess up. It is excellent though for blending colors and building tones, and that's what I'm going to show you right now. Alright, I'm going to start by laying down 4 circles here in pencil, and I'm using my 2H pencil, so it's just nice light lines. Now whenever you're doing a flesh tone on your model, one important thing is you need to know the light source, so which direction is the light coming from, so then you have your highlights, midtones, and your lowlights. The second thing is, whenever I'm doing a flesh tone, I always like to mix a couple different colors, and I like to stack that flesh tone several times. So for instance, on this girl, we're seeing this light sand as well as some pink, as well as the light sand is going on here twice, and light sand is going on here a third time. So now when we come in here to do 4 variations of flesh tones, we're going to want to know where's the light source. And we're also going to want to have a complementary color to go along with that flesh tone. Let's go ahead and start with the first one now. The first circle for the flesh tone that I'm going to do is going to be a very light flesh tone. What I'm going to use is the Chartpak marker called Buff, and my complementary color is going to be pink. We also want to know where the light source is going to come from. So I'm going to go ahead and put an arrow in here, and the light source is coming from the right side. Now that I'm ready to start coloring from the back, the first thing I want to do is when I turn this over, this again is markers only, and this is the side of the paper that's a little bit furry. If you're working on a dark surface, for instance if you have a wood table, when you're working here with this semi-translucent paper, that dark wood color is going to show through, and it's going to change your results. So if we take a look here at this model, right now she looks a little bit dulled out from the dark table behind it. And as soon as you put a nice clean white piece of paper behind her, you can see the colors are a lot more rich and stand out. So it's really important that if you are working on a wooden tabletop, you have to have some kind of a white paper behind this as we come in here and start coloring. Now here on the back side of the paper, I can see the pencil through the translucent paper. So here it is from the front. Now I want to remember this light source, but I cannot write on this side of the paper with any pencil. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up my Fleshtone. And if you're opening this for the first time, you're going to want to make sure you dab it on a cloth just in case it has a really wet tip. And I can come in here and I can emphasize my light direction. Now once you are ready to start coloring the circle, you're going to want to have your Fleshtone as well as your complementary pink color. Both of these have the caps off and they're open and ready to go. Alright, so when you're watching this for the first time, go ahead and watch me do it all the way through. And I'm going to show this to you in real time, and I want you to get a sense of how fast you need to move. So I put down a layer of buff, and then I need to immediately add my pink to that while it's still wet. And then I'm going to continue with my single layer of buff, and I'm making sure to pick up right from where I left off so there's no brush strokes. And I'm going to get this here all the way to the bottom of the circle, and then I'm going to leave it alone. Now the reason I'm showing this to you in real time is because I want you to get a sense of how long I'm letting it dry before I come back and add my second layer. Again, just to review, we used buff for a single layer and pink up in the highlight areas while it was still wet. Now at this point it's still semi-dry, semi-wet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add my second layer. So this is going to be the exact same buff marker, but I'm just stacking it and making it a little bit darker for my midtones. And because this is semi-wet, semi-dry, this is going to bleed nicely back up into that single layer. Alright, so go back to 10 minutes, 22 seconds and do this with me in real time. Now while I'm letting this dry, what I'm going to do is over here by the arrow, I'm going to put in just a rectangle of the buff color, and below it I'll do the same thing for the pink. Now while this is drying, let's take a look at the model. So here on the model you can see we have the single layer, plus there's some mid-tone that I put in there while that single layer was still wet. And then I let it dry completely, and then I come back in one last time and I get some nice sharp shadows here under her chin, her armpit, elbows, up here at her swimsuit, down here on her legs, underneath her knees. So having this third layer of sharp, edgy shadows is really important. So here we've let this dry completely, and we can come in and we'll put one last layer on here for that sharp edge shadow. So again, here's our single layer, here's our double layer, and I'll come and stack a third layer here at the bottom. Now you can see here when I lift up this paper that it definitely bleeds through to the layer underneath. So that's why I have this cheaper copy paper underneath here so I don't stain my tabletop. Now here on the front we can see what it's truly going to look like for having some pink out on her cheeks and her nose and her shoulders and knees. This is that single layer color. Here's our double layer for the mid-tones, and then here's our nice sharp shadow edges. Let's come in here and we'll label these two boxes. I'm going to do this using my micron pen, size 8. So for the skin tone we had buff. And for the pink tone we were using pink. Alright, so let's move on to the next circle now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this up to light sand, which is going to be a little bit darker and a little more orange and glow to it. Along with the light sand, my complementary pink will be the same pink color. Again, I want to get my light source on here. And when I come over to this side, I'll get my light source here using the light sand color. Again, if your marker is brand new, make sure you dab it first, just in case there's a big dot of ink on there. Also, if you store these for a long time, sometimes there'll be a lot of ink at the very first. So again, I'm going to use the light sand and the pink. I want to have both of these open at the same time. Watch me first, and I'll go through this again in actual time. Now what I want to do is I'm going to start laying down my light sand up in the highlight area where the light source is coming from. And then I'm going to throw some pink in here immediately while it's still wet, so these two colors will blend and there will be no brush strokes or hard edges. And then I need to continue with my light sand right from where I left off while it's still wet, so you have to move quickly when you're doing this. Once I finished coloring all the light sand, I need to stop touching this so I don't get any brush strokes. Now what we're doing here is I'm showing this to you in actual time so you can see how long to wait before you start adding your second layer of light sand for your mid-tone. Also keep in mind the reason we added that pink is for your cheeks and lips and shoulders and top of your knees and stuff like that. Alright, so I'm going to come back in here and add my second layer of light sand. So I'm stacking it on top of the first layer. And I'm doing this while it's semi-wet, semi-dry. That way it'll stack the layers, but it'll also bleed into the original first layer and not have a sharp edge on there. Alright, so go back to 15 minutes, 29 seconds and do this with me now. While we're waiting for this to dry completely, let's go ahead and get a rectangle of the light sand color and also the pink. What I'm going to go ahead and do is move on to the next color and let that one dry. The next color that we're going to do is going to be sand. So we're going from light sand to regular sand. Now the sand and the pink, these two chemicals do not mix very well, and the sand is a lot more stainy and dominant, so this pink will get completely lost. What we need to do now is we need to find a darker version of a pink. So I'm going to use salmon to be my complementary pink to go with sand. From the pencil side of the paper, I'm going to go ahead and get my light source for these last two circles. Now on this side, let's go ahead and start doing the sand flesh tone with the salmon pink color. Now if you want to, you can go ahead and do this with me at the same time or come back and watch it again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay down my first layer of sand, and for this darker color I need to move faster. Of course, while it's still wet, I'm going to lay down some of my salmon up in the highlight area, and then I need to get right back to adding my light sand all the way to the bottom of the circle. Always touching right where I left off, slightly overlapping and moving quickly. Once I've completed the circle, I need to just basically stop touching this, or else you're going to leave a brush stroke for sure. Now I can see here I have a little bit of some white area versus dark area, but you know what? I'm just going to leave it alone. It's too late now. I'm going to throw in my arrow for my highlight, and then let's go ahead and start adding our second layer, and this is going to be the midtones. And you can see here that actually it was already getting a little bit beyond semi-dry, and so I should have done this even a little bit sooner to have it blend back into that original first color. If you were watching along with me, you can go back to 18 minutes and 30 seconds and do this now. And then we'll go ahead and get a rectangle of some of the sand up here, as well as the salmon pink. Now I'm going to let this dry completely before I come back in and get my third layer. Now let's go ahead and come down here to our fourth circle, and we're going to do our darkest skin tone. What I'm going to do for this one is going to be craft brown. Now the craft brown is even more stainy than the sand color. And this salmon and craft brown mix together pretty good, but the salmon disappears fairly easily. So what I'm going to do is my complementary pink color is going to be deep salmon. Now these two colors are very dark and stainy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put a second piece of copy paper behind this so it's double layer thick. Once I start coloring this, I want to make sure it's not going all the way through to my tabletop. Basically, we're going to do the exact same thing again now for the fourth time. So go ahead and follow along with me and do this with me in real time. Alright, so I'm going to come in here and remind myself this is my light source. And again, since these are darker, stainier colors, we need to move fast. So up here in the highlight area, let's go ahead and get our first single layer of the craft brown. And we'll get a nice area wet. And then we need to quickly come in here and hit it with the deep salmon so this will blend and bleed together nicely. And then we need to pick up right from where we left off. And if you notice here, I'm moving a lot quicker than I did even with the sand color, because this is going to leave lots of brush strokes if you take too long. So here I'm laying down my single layer of craft brown along with the deep salmon marker. And while it's semi-wet, I want to let it just dry a little bit more till it's semi-dry. And then I can come back in and stack my second layer for a mid-tone. And since it's semi-wet, this will still blend nicely back into that dry single layer. And again, with the darker, stainier colors, you want to do this sooner when it's semi-wet. So for instance, on this one, I waited just a little bit too long, and there's almost a hard line right here that I didn't want. So I just want to make sure that I'm getting this while it's dry enough to stack a second color, but not too dry where it leaves a hard brushstroke edge. Let's go ahead and get a rectangle with our craft brown, and then a little swatch of the deep salmon. Now for all three of these, I still have yet to come back in and do my third hard shadow. Since these two are now bone dry, let's go ahead and do those. So again, here we are on the back side of the paper, and I'm going to lay in my third shadow. So if this is the light source, the shadow will be all the way down here. And this is going to leave a hard edge on there. Again, that hard edge, you will use it to your advantage when you're doing things like her knees, the inside of her thighs, shadows from her clothes or her hair, or shadows underneath her chin, her armpits, etc. I'm going to come over here to the sand, and we'll get our third layer for the shadow. And again, this is now bone dry, and here's my light source. And I'm going to wait just a little bit longer on this craft brown. It still feels just a little bit cool to the touch, which lets me know it's still a little bit wet. Now while this one is still drying, let's come back here to the front and continue labeling our colors. We've already labeled it for buff and pink. The next one down is our light sand and pink. The next one down from that was our sand and salmon. And the last one now, our darkest color, is from the craft brown and deep salmon. Now that the craft brown circle is completely dry, let's flip this over and we'll get our final third layer for the cast shadows. Again, here's our light source, so the shadow will be down here. Let's take a look here at the fronts and let's finish labeling inside the circles. Let's start up here with the first one, the buff and pink color. So I'm going to continue with using my Micron size 8 pen. Now here in the middle of the circle, following with the light source, this is single layer, and moving away from the light source was double layer, and this is our third layer. So what we're going to do is, following along this line, we're going to put 1 times, 2 times, and 3 times. Let's do the same thing here for light sand. Again, following with the light source, we have 1 times, 2 times, and 3 times. Alright, so come back up to your first one, the buff and pink, and let's go ahead and go back and just get our circle nice and dark using our size 8 micron pen, and then we can emphasize our light source and put a little square around buff and pink. And then we'll just continue doing the same thing for all the colors. So if we come back in here and we review the 4 different flesh tones, the first one using the buff marker is a very light, creamy color. And then we move into the light sand, which is a little more orange and rich and a little more glowy. Moving down into the sand color, this is starting to introduce the brown tones, but still having a little bit of some glowy red inside of it. And then the craft brown is having that deeper, rich brown color, but still having a little bit of this orangey tone inside of there. Of course, for the complementary pinks, we had regular pink for both of the buff and the light sand, and it mixes, the 2 chemicals mix really well and blend beautifully. And you have to do those pinks while it's wet. And then as you move down to sand, we're using salmon to get that pink highlight, and it works perfect with the sand. And then deep sand for the craft brown, because the deep sand needs to be richer and darker and stainier to compete with the darker craft brown. I'm going to go ahead and label mine for my students, because I get these questions all the time. What should I do for a Hispanic girl? What should I do for an Asian girl? If you want to, you can go ahead and label yours with me now. What I would say in this instance is the first one would be similar to Asian. The light sand would be closer to a European. The sand color is moving now towards Hispanic and Latina. And then of course the craft brown is moving into African. Now with that said, of course, it doesn't exactly apply to those different nationalities. So for instance, if I were to say I'm Caucasian and I would fit with the European, if you compare my hand to this, I'm actually a little bit more tan than that because I'm outdoors a lot. And if I flip my hand over, then you can start to see we're moving back more towards the buff side. So this is how I would look in the winter time. This is how I look in the summertime. So of course, labeling these can be a little bit confusing, but if you were to just keep it really general, that's kind of what I would be shooting for if I'm doing fashion renderings. For those of you who are taking this as part of my class, go ahead and take a picture of this and submit this to me as part of your assignment for completing this video. And now that we're finished with this part of the project, go ahead and make sure all the caps are closed tightly on your pens, and always store them horizontally so the tips don't dry out. Alright, so for this part of the video, what I'm going to do is, along with buff, light sand, sand, and craft brown, obviously there's a few more options for doing some different flesh tone variations. I'm going to show you a few more options here for doing a range in the lighter colors, and then we'll move down into this mid-tone and the darker tones. Alright, let's take a closer look at these now. I'm going to start here with the buff and light sand flesh tones and a couple other flesh tones that can fall inside of there. Okay, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just videotape myself putting these colors down, and it'll help your eye to get a really good sense of what the color looks like coming out of the marker right onto the paper. So later on when you're making decisions on which ones you want to buy, this will help you compare them side by side. Alright, some other variations that we have here for these lighter flesh tones would be your warm gray number 1 and beige. And of course, here's what buff looks like, and here's what light sand looks like. And then for the complementary pink color inside of here, the chemicals that mix really well with this is sunset pink, the pink that we used, and flesh. The reason for using like a flesh tone is if you wanted the beige or the warm gray number 1 to look a little more warm and glowy, then you would use kind of this flesh tone as opposed to just a pink, making it look really pink. The sunset pink will also kind of help inside of the warm gray number 1. Okay, so now let's look at some different marker colors that fall in line with kind of this mid darker tone. Now if we move here to the mid-tones, we could see pale cherry, desert tan, sand, which is the one that I used here, and suntan. Now the reason I like sand for this is because it has a nice glowy, rich color to it. It has some kind of a reddish in there, maybe even a little bit of an orange color. And then of course that mixes really well with the salmon. And if you wanted to tone down this pink shade a little bit, you could come in with the blush instead, and it'll get a little more washed out inside of these darker colors. Now the desert tan is kind of a weird color, but once you stack it and add some pinks to it, it does look nice. And the pale cherry starts to get really reddish looking as you add more layers to it. The suntan itself is kind of a flat, matte looking color, so it needs to have a little more blush added to that to give it a little more of a glow. And then we'll take a look at a few options here for the darkest flesh tone. And then for the darker flesh tones, craft brown is what we used here. There's another variation which is this sepia, has a little more blue in it. The craft brown's a little more orangey reddish. And then mocha is just a darker variation of the sepia, and it has some of that blue and red inside of there as well. The mocha, if you stack it too many times, it'll get way too dark and it's hard to see your model, so I would recommend just stacking it once and twice. The craft brown stacks for a third time really well, and sepia could also do that. For all of these, they're really dark and stainy, so we'll use the deep salmon to come in and bring in some pink highlights. So I hope that gives you a really good sense of how to do 4 different flesh tones and why I choose the markers that I choose. Plus you're able to get some kind of a reference for other markers that you might already own or you're thinking of buying. If you like this video, I hope you move on to watch the video for doing a swimsuit with brown hair. And then I'm in the makings for doing a prom dress with sparkles as well as see-through, sheer, and silky. And then we're doing a full overcoat with the glossy rain boots. And then there's also a video that's already finished for the white dress shirt, jeans, and blonde hair.